Um, Good morning, everyone. Before I begin, I wish to express my gratitude to the Oxford Center for Left Writing for this opportunity to discuss my research, and of course to Sally Bayley, whose work I'm deeply honored to be discussing today. So my research focuses on the analysis of Sally's trilogies, which includes the books Go With That, No Boys Play Here, and The Green Lady. Can you hear me well? Yeah? Okay. So these books are located at the intersection of autobiography, biography, memoir, and literary fiction. And because of this distinctive hybridity, I believe these works epitomize the experimental quality of contemporary life writing practices. And these books are the peculiar thing about them is that they challenge traditional demarcations between literary categories, and they cast their own unconventional original form. Just to provide some context about the books, the trilogy portrays the author's coming-of-age story from childhood to maturity. So at the beginning of the narrative, we have Bayley. We see her, Sally as a child. She is just 4 years old in Go With That. And until the moment when she took this brave, dramatic decision to put herself up for adoption. In fact, Sally is the first person to go to university from the West Sussex care system. And the first two volumes, they perform this shifting relationship between fiction and non-fiction. So you have here a quote I chose from Go With That, which I found particularly significant. What is peculiar about them is that they intertwine the author's personal story, the author's personal account, with literary canon. So you have these childlike perspectives. Sally creates these childlike perspectives, and as a child, she starts immersing herself into the world of books to escape the difficulties of her home environment. And she creates this imaginary geography. And what is peculiar is that the protagonist not only filters all the experiences of her life through the plots and characters of the books she reads, but she also comes to live a life inside the pages of those books. So they become quite another dimension of life. I also want to draw briefly your attention to the subtitle of Go With That, which is A Life Built by Books. And these books, as I'm showing here, are the novels of Bronte, Dickens, and Christie in the first volume, and Shakespearean drama in the second one. As I'm analyzing the trilogy, sorry, it's not appearing anymore. We are missing some slides. I wanted to show you. I don't know how it's not working. They disappeared. We had like 20 slides. Can someone maybe help with that? I'm missing all the slides.
Do you want to try your PowerPoint version instead of the PDF?
Yeah, okay, great.
Okay, I'll just share screen again. Hold on.
Why it disappeared?
Not good.
Okay. Sorry for the inconvenience.
Thank you. Thank you. That's
Let it go. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. I was saying, as I'm analyzing the trilogy as a whole, I've been considering different categories for these books. I've been exploring the definition of memoir, which is the one that has been editorially chosen for the books. And then I've been considering anti-memoir, which is how the author self-defines the books. And also been exploring this definition of bibliomemoir, that is quite a new word, so new in fact that it has yet to be registered in the Oxford English Dictionary, and which defines a kind of memoir that explores the interplay between life and literature, and also the influence of reading, especially childhood reading, on one's life, on shaping one's life. And because of this peculiar blending we were mentioning before between fiction and nonfiction, I also been analyzing the genre of autofiction, which, as we know, blurs boundaries within autobiographical and novelistic modes. Although each book could be discussed really for hours to come, today's discussion will be focused on The Green Lady. Just as the first two books of the trilogy, this third volume escapes any easy categorization. So I believe that this book pushes Bayley's experimentation with life writing to new heights. And the book, as we will discuss, the book connects personal memories and archival sources. Then we have also these imaginary biographies, and we also have the shifting through different historical times, and the narrative is also framed by real and imaginary settings. In The Green Lady, I was mentioning before this child narrator perspective. Here, sorry about that. Here we have this evolution to a mature focalization, which entails a greater level of experimentalism with style, content, subjectivity. And we also have this mixture of biography, autobiography, fictional lives, and family history. That's why, for the analysis of Bayley's works, I've been focusing on the definition of auto/biography, as it entails a greater openness and inclusivity across genres, and including also encompassing the writing of one's own and others' life. I feel like this slash in the term signifies this inherent reciprocity between the self and other in telling a life story. And I also, following on that, included here some critical perspectives, which highlight how autobiographical narrative can be regarded not as a solitary, but as a relational story. And in particular, these other quotes, maybe I could read one if you cannot see that. I've also been analyzing the concept of relationality in autobiographical narrative, because I think that it underscores not only the relationship between individual lives and other people's lives, but also to the wider historical and social structures. So, for example, these quotes I put here, maybe I can move that, yeah. So the autobiographical approach highlights the interdependence of autobiography and biography, giving a means to understand identity in its society. Individuals draw on wider cultural narratives and symbols in the telling of their stories. It is these interconnections that an autobiographical approach explores. I think that relational narratives, so they include some, in a way, significant others to which the author can relate his or her own story. And I believe this particularly applies to Bayley's books, since the narrator's story is not revealed. Sorry, I'll move it again. As I was saying, the narrator's story is not revealed in a straightforward way, but I would say is rather refracted through the stories of other individuals whose story is important in the author's self-formation, in the author's development. And I have in this slide some significant others we can find in the books, because in The Green Lady, we observe connections and kinships of different kinds. And we have the representation of different individuals from different eras and historical times. Just to lay some ground, just a few minutes more before we start our discussion, I think it's important to know that at the core of the narrative, there is this relationship, lies the relationship between the author and their grandmother, which she regards as pivotal in our development. And the narrative also connects personal, different archives and different ways of remembering. So we have personal memories, but we also have I will say, public documents in a way, because we can find a connection which is displayed through quotes and through other, this intertwining between the author's life and Mary Neal's unpublished autobiography. Mary Neal was a suffragette, and we'll maybe discuss that later. This quote I put here is taken from the book, and it describes the fictional lives the author creates. And at the end, I put, I don't know if you can see that, it's Literary for Mothers, Virginia Woolf. I believe that in the way, as I was just saying, Sally creates these imaginary biographies, you can connect The Green Lady to Orlando. It's the first thing that comes to your mind. But I believe that Bayley inherits Virginia Woolf tradition of the new. So this experimentalism, which starts in a way, she inherits this tradition. And I was thinking in particular just today when I was coming here to a quote from an essay by Virginia Woolf, which is the essay, The New Biography. And she uses the expression granite and rainbow. Granite and rainbow signifying the granite-like solidity of historical facts, but also the rainbow-like intangibility of human personality, which is something Sally masterfully does in her works, and which I think really connects this work to Virginia Woolf. It is maybe on that note that I can now leave the floor to Sally, because I'm sure she will give us a deeper insight into her vision of literary art. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Eleonora, thank you very much. I cannot imagine doing that in Italian. That's all I can do as I was listening to you speak, so extraordinary. Can I speak louder? Is that loud enough?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Microphones are quite difficult to manage if you're trying to, can you hear me now? Is that all right? Yes. So all writers have obsessions. All writers have images and symbols that they return to as a form of consolation and solace and shape. I walk into the room and I see lines and shapes. That's the nature of my particular obsessive mind. So I look at the shape of this table and I see a corridor. I see at the beginning of a house, I see architecture. This is a book built around shapes and architecture. It's a house of sorts. It's a new house and it's a new home. It's an historic house and it's an historic home where the child reader becomes a writer and an artist. So it's a coming of age story of a child who's read enough books that she's ready to start writing, to put it very simply. So by the end of the story, she is a writer. So she declares herself to be that thing we all want. I wanted to be since I was 4 years old. But to go back to shapes and architecture, there is a space in this book, which is a hallowed space. It's a space of deep memory, a deep treasure, deep folklore, and that is the Green Lady Lane in Littlehampton, West Sussex. It grew up. And I traversed that lane up and down every day for 10 or 12 years. And when I speak about my writing, I have to move, and moving at the moment is actually quite difficult for various reasons. But I cannot imagine writing without moving and without thinking about shapes. So the Green Lady Lane, if you like, was my first shape. And it's the shape of a corridor or a lane. And now that I've matured and grown up and become more sensible and sophisticated and read a lot of books and thought a bit more deeply about why shapes matter so much, I realized that I have connected that shape of the corridor, which my grandmother pushed me down on her bicycle every day until I was old enough to go to school myself. I've connected that lane with a famous sentence, which I adore, from Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, which is probably one of the greatest works of mourning ever written. And I would say that The Green Lady is also a work of mourning, but there's a sentence that has always escaped me in terms of its meaning on the level of syntax. And those of you who know Wolf will know the sentence. I made Eleonora write it up last night, late, because I never know how to say this sentence, because it's so full of feeling and it's so incomplete. But the shape that it owns, that it traverses, is that of a dark corridor. And it's perhaps the greatest statement of grief that I know of. And it's really the sentence that I travel along and through, and I carried as I was writing this book. Mr. Ramsay, stumbling along a passage one dark morning, stretched his arms out. But Mrs. Ramsay, having died rather suddenly the night before, his arms, though stretched out, remained empty. And it's that gesture that structures the Green Lady. It is the Green Lady Lane, it is a corridor, and it is my arms as a child, which are, sorry, my voice goes slightly at the moment, but it just adds dramatic effect. My arms stretched out as I go looking for my ancestors. This is a book which is in search of, through voice play and impersonation of voices and characters. This is a book that goes in search of the child's literary and historic ancestors. So it is also built around real people, and Eleonora was very careful to draw attention to that fact. I'm going to introduce you now briefly to the way in which I write, and the only way I can do that is by performing. I suppose I've always been a bit of a performer, but it's also how I embody my words. So I can't just sit there and, you know, be all nice and proper. I have to move, I'm afraid. I have to roam. And as a child, I spent years of my life roaming around my hometown, marking it out by the tread of my feet, like this, walking. And I think that really also is poetry. Poetry, of course, is built around metrics, feet, rhythms, etc., etc. How many feet in a line of poetry? We're taught that at school. There's a restlessness to this book. There's a searching and there's a restlessness, and there's an attempt to bring together different aspects of voice from the past and from the present day self of the child as she is maturing and coming into knowledge of herself and the community in which she finds herself. So I'm just going to read or perform just a few shards so you can hear how I merge voices together. The first person you need to know about is Mary Neal. She's one of the several Marys in this book. There are many Marys. Mary, Mary, quite contrary. Mary, Mary, quite contrary. That's me, by the way. Mary, Mary, quite contrary. My mother called me that too. But now I see Mary's face peeking from the window, and it is like my grandmother's face. Yet once Mary was young. She wore a pinafore dress tied behind her back with a sash bow and a petulant look. Mary is cross. Mary is young. Mary is old. That's history. One day you wake up and you look at yourself in the mirror and you see an old lady with a crinkly face while the child is still peeking out. My grandmother's eyes were soft and small and sometimes red with weeping, but it's her hands that I recall most of all. Blue and papery thin, blue rivers on white sand with peppery ridges. Look at your hand, you see, there's a whole world there. Geography. My mother was a cartographer, so the language of maps also informs this book. She drew maps for a living, so we were told, before I was born. She was also a seamstress. So I bring together the language of maps, the language of movement, and the language of sewing. The Mary there is me, but the Mary is also Mary from the Secret Garden, which informs this book. It's perhaps the leading text for the younger self. And the other Mary is Mary Neal, the suffragette, who is, I suppose, in some senses, a spirit of place and also a tutelary spirit to the young child. Her house stood on the corner of the Green Lady Lane. Do you have a picture of it somewhere, Eleonora? Sure. And I was fascinated by the shape of this house. According to historic archives, at some point in time, my family was involved in the business of building churches. So the language of architecture is somewhere deeply buried, probably inside my DNA, and it's how I see the world. I come into a room and I watch it. And I think I said to Rebecca as I came in, and to Alice, I said, the geography of this building is not intuitive. So you start going around this way and then you come to a cul-de-sac and you think, what is this? You know, who made this? This is not intuitive. This building is the Green Lady Hostel, which stands on the corner of the Green Lady Lane and East Street in Littlehampton. And it's there that Mary Neal, who is one of the presiding spirits of place of this book, came down from London to create a home space, a holiday home for poor seamstresses from the slums of Somerstown, which is around St Pancras in London. She came down to teach them how, as she put it in her own words in her autobiography, to teach them how to dance and sing traditional folk songs, to learn how to move, to swim in the sea, to get sun on their limbs, etc., etc., an old-fashioned seaside holiday. But she also taught them Shakespeare, and she taught them to dance and to sing so that they could be freed from the oppressive weight of menial manual work in the factories where they were employed for 12, 14 hours a day. She wanted them to experience what she called lyrical ecstasy in their body. And when I read that in her unpublished autobiography, I wanted my book to have that same sense of lyrical ecstasy, of movement, which comes out of, I suppose, a kind of singing voice. My mother had a beautiful singing voice, and in some senses, that's how I learned how to write. She would sing when she was washing her hair on Sundays. That's something that, an image that comes up in the first part. Girl with dove. Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With silver bells and cockle shells and pretty little maids in a row, with pretty little maids in a row. It doesn't matter, my voice is wavering, I can hear it. But what I'm doing is I'm going in search of the sound of the past. And before I come to an event, knowing that I'm going to be nervous, I settle myself by singing nursery rhymes, hymns, and folk songs. And somehow the sounds of those rhythms become embedded in my consciousness, and I know where I am. I know where I am. This book, I think as a reader, is quite a challenging book. And if you've read the other books, you'll know I don't make it easy for the reader. When I am interviewed, particularly at the start of my career, whatever that means, as a writer, I was asked about facts all the time. They wanted to know about the terrible things that had happened in my terrible childhood and how awful it had all been, etc., etc. What they couldn't quite deal with was the joy that I have, which comes from embedded sound and rhythm and images, which led me out of whatever misery it was they expected me to tell them of. So this book is a much more hopeful book, and that's something I wanted to say as well. I chose my tutelary spirits well. I chose Mary Neal because of her location in this presiding space of memory and mourning, which is my corridor space, which is the lane where I travelled down as a child. I then chose my grandmother, Edna May Turner. She, I imagined, quite plausibly was related to the famous artist Joseph Mallet William Turner, whose name I heard over and over again as a child. Joseph Mallet William Turner, Joseph Mallet William Turner, Joseph Mallet William Turner. And so I decided we were relatives, and indeed we are, very distantly so. The great Cockney painter of light. And the painting that informs this book in some ways, there are many, I'm afraid, sources that inform this book, which drive Eleonora mad, but that's what I do, is the famous painting of Shoreham Harbour. Can we look at that, Eleonora?
Yes, sure.
Which in some ways is the culmination of the entire book. One of the other things, other events, aesthetic events, if you like, that happens in this book, apart from the work of mourning and of treading the ground of the town where she grew up, looking for a way out through the language of cartography and maps, is the language of painting. The book starts with a sketchbook, and it speaks of faint lines meaning memory lines, lines of memory which are there and not there, gossamer threads. Joseph Mallet William Turner sketched barely perceptible lines. And in fact, I don't have good eyesight, you can't even see those. Tiny little promontories and shapes. So it's like little spider threads, right? Little quick, barely perceptible lines, which he took home, I imagine he put his sketchbook in his pocket, he took home. And then over the course of time, the great unveiling of this extraordinary work, which is Shoreham Harbour, which I saw printed everywhere throughout my childhood. We were very, very proud of the fact that Joseph Mallet William Turner came down to Sussex to paint us. And this is his famous Shoreham Harbour. It's in some ways, I suppose, one of the places of deep nostalgia for all of us who grew up in this area, but it's also the place where my grandmother was born, and it's where the book starts. And if I had to summarise why I work so closely with this painting, which I looked up every day for about 3 years, and I blew it up and I blew it down and I carried it around and I made it look really bad, I almost rubbed it out, and then I imagined it being populated with a chorus, a community of voices, a kind of polyphony of place. And as I started to own this painting, as though it were mine, it's actually in Petworth House in Sussex, I could do this. I did this over and over again. You know, I wanted to know the shape of this basin of light. This is my basin of light. I believe I own that basin of light. I've studied it so much. So it's this container of light, which the book and the child narrator, who becomes older as the book proceeds, crosses time and space, the child wants to contain the light somehow, to show the reader how it is that you can develop an image or a way of seeing, starting with barely perceptible lines. There is actually a church here, which is St. Mary de Hora. Here it is. St. Mary de Hora is the church of the harbour or of the sea in Shoreham. How you can develop these faint lines and turn it into something like this. And you know, that's a very complicated thing that we need to perhaps discuss in greater depth, the aesthetic process by which I develop my images. But certainly one of those processes is learning to the basic shape of the place, so you can hold that in your mind, almost photographically so. And photographs are very important to this book. There are many images of photographs being developed. But I suppose once I got my basin of light shape in place, I sort of carried it around with me, and light comes up in every part of that book to dispel the darkness, I should say, of the second part of my trilogy, my not trilogy. Thank you, Rebecca, my not trilogy. I'm very stubborn. I don't like to be categorised. I push them away as soon as they arrive. But No Boys Play here is a very dark book because it takes on poverty and desperation, broken male lives, a kind of violent nonsense, if you like, erupts in that book. It's completely nonsensical and absurd. It's dark, dark absurdity. It's men lying around on threadbare carpets, drinking themselves silly, and then committing suicide, unfortunately, because they are deranged from having no place in the world, no basin of light. So this book tries to make amends, and it carries us away from the darkness, and it washes it away, although it doesn't pretend that difficult things aren't there. Mary Neal was a woman who educated the poor, and the word poor is all over my book, lest we should ever forget the poor. But just to summarize what I did, I wanted to think about ways in which light works for the artist. I studied Joseph Mallet William Turner's painting technique and his obsession with light, like Monet's obsession with light, and this need for there to be a moment of revelation. And I think that's really what I want to finish with, this idea of there being a moment of revelation, an epiphany, we would say, if we were speaking about James Joyce's literature, or, you know, a moment where everything coalesces and you have what the artist in To a Lighthouse says, Lily, the painter in that particular novel, says, my vision, I've had my vision. So this for me was the moment of vision. And so I had to end the book with this painting actually being painted live. So I studied the ways in which Joseph Malibury Turner painted obsessively. And then because I've always wanted to be a visual artist, and my mother was, I wasn't, alas, terrible at drawing. I taught myself imaginatively how to paint. So in the final pages of this book, I paint Shoreham Harbour. And I have to say, in words, it works, but I would never be able to do that. But I paint Shoreham Harbour, and the heroines, for me, after, you know, we've done the Basin of Light stuff, and there's a moment of revelation, which for me comes traditionally, of course, through the clouds, but it's the way that the light plays off those two surfaces. But it's these women I'm most interested in. It's these obscure lives perched on the edge of the cliff that I leave us with, because that's the start of my next book. We have to come up with a new word for that. But it's my next relative, and I've just finished it. It's called Pond Life. And these obscure lives here, which I animate and make my own and create my own biography for these women, these nobodies, these obscure, we can't even see their faces. I take those women, I adopt them, and I write up their lives across time. And one of the characters that you meet in this book, her name is Edith Cull, and she's a poor spinster who is loosely based on my music teacher. And I've always been interested in those people in our society who are not easily divisible because they don't have money and they don't have status. So, you know, the left behinds, whatever you want to call, whatever patronizing phrase we now use today, those people that nobody pays attention to. It's that person that alerts the child's imagination in this book. It's that person she adopts. And she says of Miss Cull, in the section which is about writing, the child taking her notebook and deciding who her subject will be, she says, I will keep you, Miss Cull. And the reason she keeps her is because she's interested in the fraught business of pity. What does it mean to pity someone? I only knew as a child what it felt like in my stomach. But I knew that we pitied Miss Cull because she was poor and she was drab. And that's the subject of Pond Life, which is the next relative. I create obsessive chains of, you know, like those paper chains of men and women, you know, those, I do that with books. So Miss Cull will also have a relative. She'll have a nice posh lady with a big house who will be her other self in Pond Life. That's all I want to say. I hope that made sense. It's very hard to speak in whatever amount of time I had. I didn't even put my bonnet on either. That was supposed to be my prop anyway. I did it without it.
Thank you so much.
I am losing my voice, so I'm very sorry. My singing was absolutely terrible.
No, it was great. Thank you so much for that. It was so inspiring and great. Maybe I was wondering if we could start
some questions.
this question. I can ask
Yeah.
you some questions, and maybe then the rest of us can also ask Solly some questions. Maybe I can pick up on this point we were discussing before, the painting, this powerful imagery. So into the narrative, you have, I will say, several narrative layers. You can read this work in so many different ways, but you can connect. I'm sorry about that. I don't know how to turn this on, actually.
Okay,
Is it working? No. Can you not hear me? Yeah.
could you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's on. Okay. Oh, great. Thanks. I'm sorry. That's not so many times.
Could you hear me all right?
I could.
Yes, I'm a bit of a boomer once I get going.
No. Yeah, so as I was saying, get closer, okay. So the work contains several narrative layers, a powerful visual imagery that Sally creates, that she depicts in words, because you don't really have pictures of photographs, but she describes everything in detail, so you can actually see it when you read the book. And the image that struck me the most is this image of the painting by William Turner. And what is peculiar is that Sally starts describing in detail the sketch the painter produces before the actual painting. And I was thinking of those faint lines, maybe as a metaphor for memory as being fragile, memory from the past, from a very distant past. And maybe we could discuss that, what these fine lines represent for you.
Forgetting, I suppose they represent forgetting, you know, the fear of forgetting, and the fear of replicating, because you don't wish to replicate the past. Who wants that? No, you want to write over the past. You want to, in some ways, remake it. So you have to erase before you can start again. And Eleonora has asked me several questions about my sources, and I almost don't want to know them for my own sake. So what I have often done is I've consulted, for example, the Daily Mail from the 40s, because I was looking for a nobody. I'm interested in, as I've already said, the people who disappear from reportage, from history. I'm also interested in the reporters themselves. And there's a character at the end of this book called Binks, who just appears out of nowhere. Like blink of the eye. I'm always playing around with words in the most annoying way. And my brother's always texting me to say, I think you've made a mistake on page 144. I say, no, that's deliberate. That's supposed to be Binks. But I'm interested in the reporter as well. So the reporter who gets to tell the story at the end of what happens in Cherbourg Harbour in France in 1944. And the ship that he's on, or the boat that he's on rather, goes down and he dies. And I found him in a Daily Mail report from 1944, but actually everything that I write about him is made up. Okay. And if I were to go looking for that now, I think I would send myself off on the wrong track, because in a way I've created a new being from a small report which I found in a newspaper.
Yeah.
But there is something about the fact he is a Daily Mail reporter that mattered to me, because the Daily Mail was like the Quran in our house. My aunt used to read it out loud as though it were some kind of holy text. Most days.
Yeah.
So the Daily Mail is a signifier for me of news in my household. So.
Yeah, so historical sources as well as imaginative settings.
Yes.
And in fact, while reading, I was thinking about this pattern, this temporal pattern, which is not linear progressive, but it's rather multi-directional. So you have your views of historical time. It's really peculiar. And I love how you connect your personal archive to the archive of other people. We were mentioning Mary Neal's autobiography. And maybe you could tell us more about these different temporalities you create, because you just said you are using some historical sources, but you connect your life to a genealogy. So this testifies the power of literature to connect people across time and space, which you do wonderfully. Maybe you could talk a bit more about this genealogy you trace, starting from your grandmother, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. So my grandmother is the presiding spirit of place. She was the adult who replaced my mother when my mother was ill. So she was my surrogate mother. She was a foster mother in some sense within my own home. Can you hear me now? Exactly. So there was my grandmother, and she taught me how to read. So I associate my grandmother with words. And so first of all, Edna May Turner. I then create a partner, so a kind of a dyad between my grandmother and Mary Neal. Mary Neal has an archive. She's a relatively well-known figure in folk history, folk music, folk song and dance. And she has an archive online which I could consult. My grandmother has no archive. There are no letters, almost no photographs of my grandmother. So she is, as the French say, disparue. She's completely gone. She's vanished. She's not there, like your slides. Not there, not there, nothing there, except what I have in my memory. And the strongest form of memory we have is that of affection or aversion, I would say. Affection or aversion. My grandmother was my main source of affection. And for me, affection is always related to movement. It's because I was loved by my grandmother that I was able to move away. So affection, I think, enables us to move if it's a healthy form. So my grandmother, I wed her to Mary Neal. And if I can just read a tiny bit just to help the audience hear what I do. One of the things when I teach writing is I try to get my students to think about the magic that can occur around the edges of paragraphs. I think so I'm going to be a bit teachly just for one moment, but I think we've lost the art of creating magic between paragraphs, transitions or tensions or relationships of some kind. So the way that I write is I see a paragraph as a place of power, particularly at the top and at the bottom. So when I first read to you just now or performed, I had the refrain, Mary, Mary, quite contrary, but just above that, there was actually a little bit of dialogue which I found directly from Mary Neal's archive, and it was her mother speaking to her and reprimanding her and telling her off, and her mother says this. So Mary Neal hovers just above my refrain, Mary, Mary, quite contrary, as a transition, if you like, through time, and it's through song that I do that. Then Mary asked Mother, why are we all so fat? Why is grandfather fat? Why are we always eating? And Mother hissed at her, wash out your mouth. Now, Mary always calls her mother, mother, in that starchy Victorian way that children did. And so I just take tiny bits of direct dialogue from the unpublished archive, and then I just play with it to see what happens. The main knot or tie, if you like, you think of that sash bow. I'm very fond of thinking through metaphors of sewing because of my mother. The tie or the link across time is the name Mary. And the book culminates, I'm afraid there are many culminations, I'm that kind of writer, but in the center of the book, there is a brief biography. It's called a brief biography, where I actually announce to my reader the facts of the matter about Mary Neal, so that you actually understand, because she is a person of historic importance, and because I want you to have true affection for her as a reader, I tell you that Mary Neal is a green lady, and I the way I work with typography, so that you know that this is for real, like a headline in a newspaper or an archive. I'm very sensitive to typography as a writer, probably because my grandmother taught me how to type in a very old-fashioned way, and that's one of the other forms of instruction in this book, is the typing lessons that I had on Saturday morning. So this had to look proper. So halfway through the book, there's an announcement, and the register of the book changes and moves into something more like, not exactly straightforward biography, but a confession of one's sources, because it is important to know that Mary Neal was, in fact, an historic person with an archive. And I do say that here. Writers must acknowledge their sources, and Mary is a composite character. And I sort of announce my methodology as well. The whole section there is about the composite character, composing, bringing together different elements of the past and different elements of several women's lives. But I go into a slightly more factual biographical voice there. And above that, I have a quotation which I love of Mary Neal by her friend Roy Judge. She brought into the atmosphere the sparkle of a clear, frosty winter day. She brought into the atmosphere the sparkle of a clear, frosty winter day. And in my mind, that is also my grandmother speaking, because her language was the language of the weather. And she taught me how to listen to the weather forecast in a kind of sacred religious way, as though, it were Macbeth's three witches speaking to us through our old Philips or Roberts radio. So,
yeah, thank you so much.
Does that make sense?
Yes, sure. Yeah. Your grandmother was your roots in a way,
yes.
because you have all these little pictures, depictions of flowers and roots and plants.
Yes.
So you have this visual imagery of nature, of the green, which is on the color. And just about what we were saying about Mary Neal, and to connect to the point you were discussing before, these lives of the obscures, maybe I'll move. So we could say that Mary Neal's life was devoted to the philanthropic cause to help people from the margins of society, especially women. And in a sense, you do the same because you imagine a life for these people from the margins of society, these people small at the corner of the painting. And I found a quote again from Virginia Woolf, The Autobiography, where she says, "The question now inevitably asks itself whether the lives of great men only should be recorded. Is not anyone who has lived a life and left a record of that life worthy of biography? The failures as well as the successes, the humble as well as the illustrious. And what is greatness and what smallness? We must revise our standards of merit and set up new heroes for our admiration." May I ask if your idea of life writing aligns with that? Do you agree with that?
Can I be really cheeky and ask Julia to answer a bit about that? Because I'm
sure,
I don't know if I do life writing.
Yeah, because you do like
I'm
lives of the obscure. It's exactly what you do.
That's
That's exactly what you do. Yeah.
I do write up
yeah,
lives of the obscure, but Julia, I know that you are interested in this kind of work, and I just wondered if you could say something about the correspondence between Wolf's understanding of life writing and what I'm doing, perhaps.
I think there's so much resonance. That was one of the main things that struck me when reading this book, was how Wolfian it was, and how the prose style felt a bit like the waves. That was what it made me think of, and how much the references to visual art and the setting by the sea made me think of To the Lighthouse and Lily Briscoe in that novel. I think very much the way in which you're drawing out these people who have been overlooked by
that's exactly
the biographical tradition of great men, and you're sort of looking at who are the small women, in a sense, the quiet women,
that's exactly what
who haven't had their experiences valued in the same way. And you're sort of giving them the spotlight in a very beautiful way.
Yeah. That's why we chose to highlight this part of the painting, these women. And I also put here some just some data I found really interesting, because Mary Neal was included in the dictionary of Oxford Dictionary of National Biography in 2004. And so you can see the percentages of women included there, which I find really interesting as well. It's a point maybe that could deserve a broader discussion. And also I feel we already highlighted these connections between your life, the lives of historical characters, the life related to your family history, but I also feel you create a kind of relationship with the reader, because you address the reader very frequently. You say at one point, there's someone reading, there's someone like you, someone else, someone listening while I'm writing that all down. So I feel you create a relational pattern also with reference to the reader. Maybe we could read a small passage that's about the writing dream. Maybe we could also discuss who the ideal reader could be, like who are you addressing?
So the part that Eleonora is referring to is the second part, and it's called What the Child Saw. It's inspired by the lessons that my grandmother gave me when I was 8 years old in typing. So my grandmother had taken the traditional Pitman's course in typing, which secretaries took in the 40s and 50s, in order to work for somebody else. And the image of the secretary and the reporter who types up the thing from the grand man also plays out all the way through this. We have an encounter with Stevie Smith, the poet, who was known as a secretary to Sir Neville Pearson. So she wrote up her poetry in her lunch hour. So, there's a long tradition of this kind of the woman being an amanuensis, I suppose, to a great man. That idea of Dorothea and Casaubon, etc., in George Eliot's Middlemarch. But in about a third of the way through, I do something which I suppose you're not supposed to do as a writer. I write up a dream, and my editor wasn't happy with that. I don't subscribe to the idea that you can't write up dreams. Martin Amis says this. I think men don't write up dreams. Women write up dreams because they write in their dreams because there is no other place in which to do it. So the content of dreams has always been crucial to my understanding of writing. And indeed, as a child, I grew up in the most bizarre household. You only get a tiny sense of that in Go With Dove, perhaps. But one of the questions my mother used to ask me on the way to the bathroom in the morning at 7 a.m. was, what did your dream say? So I was taught the language of symbols in the Jungian sense from a very early age. And for me, it's now completely natural that we take our dreams seriously. And of course, it's there in the tradition of the Old Testament. We listen to great men with their dreams. Daniel, for example. So why can't a child take her dreams seriously? And why aren't women allowed to write about dreams as writers? It's the same thing with sex, isn't it? We're not supposed to not write about sex well, but I think some of us can. That's to come. But there is this section about the dream, and I think it's also very much inspired by my reading of Alice in Wonderland at an early age. That scene where Alice through the looking glass is traveling backwards on a train. And I found that terrifying. I still do. I have to rearrange myself when I'm on a train in order to face the right way. But there's something very important about the dream being inside a railway carriage. And of course, apart from Alice, there is also the famous essay by Virginia Woolf on modern fiction, Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, which takes place in a railway carriage. And for me, the unit of the railway carriage signifies the unit of the paragraph, and the connection between the carriages is a way of thinking about the paragraph. And it's something I've wanted to do something quite radical with for some time, which I've started to do, I hope, in my next book, Pond Life, which is inspired by Brief Encounter, the film, which is mostly around the railway cafe and station. It is always the same dream. I'm on a train and the countryside around is passing by, but it is very blurry and I can't distinguish anything in particular. No landmarks, no specific attributes, no hills or trees. But I know the landscape is passing me by because that is what happens on trains. So it's a moment when the child writer cannot see. There are no specific objects that she can tell you about. Everything is a blur, which is sort of how I am now at the moment with my eyes going. Nothing else is going on and I am alone in my carriage. There are no fellow passengers and I have no ticket, but we are moving. I have no idea where I am going, only that we are heading somewhere, the train and me. I look ahead and there is a blank wall, the blank wall of the carriage. I keep staring and nothing happens, but the train keeps moving smoothly along. I know I'm not driving the train, but someone is, because everything outside is fast and blurry. I can't keep up with it. I can't see to see outside the carriage window. But in my dream, I am writing down the words of the dream. I am telling myself the story of a girl on a train waiting for her destination. She is waiting for an announcement, for someone to tell her where she is heading. I call this the writing dream, because inside my dream, I am telling myself the story of my dream, and I am writing it down so I can tell someone else, someone like you, because there is always someone else here, someone listening, someone reading, when I am writing it all down. But there is no paper, and there is no pen, and my hands are not moving. Still, I know I am writing, so somewhere there must be a notebook or a typewriter. Somehow I am writing or typing. I listen. For the clickety-clack. The cricket attack. The cricket attack. And that for me is typing. It's the sound of my grandmother teaching me how to type. And it's also the sound of the railway as I leave.
Great. That's really great. Thank you, Sally, for that. Yeah, I love like what you speak here. So that's I felt more into the narrative because you're addressing actually the reader. So I felt like being in this carriage, in this train with you going around. And I love these spaces that you create, this connection also to some particular places, to culture, memory, myths and legends. As you were saying before, the Green Lady, I think we have a quote here. The Green Lady, she's related to Celtic mythology. And I feel like now that I'm listening to you, reading the book, this book is so close to the tradition of oral storytelling in a way, because you have some sentences, some refrains that return throughout the narrative at specific point of the narrative. Do you feel like it's something important, this poetic period of oral storytelling? Is it something important into your writing craft, maybe?
It's a way of self-soothing, I would say, actually. It's a kind of mnemonic. It's a way of hearing a refrain, so I know where I'm going, because the writing dream, I don't know where I'm going.
Yeah.
Nothing is schematized. Nothing is schematized. I don't schematize where I'm going when I write. So those refrains, as we can hear them, maybe one or two of them here. You will never see her come, you will never see her go. You will never see her come, you will never see her go. History is full of mothers who lie in bed, fretting and forgetting to put out the supper. History is full of mothers lying in bed, fretting and forgetting to put out the supper. It's a kind of self-soothing as well. And it's a way of embedding myself in the sound of words, as though I were planting seeds in the ground, hoping that it will go somewhere. So I think, as I've already said, Eleonora, I learned how to write from several deeper forms of craft. One of them was my mother's sewing. One of them was architecture, and I was interested to find out that we were architects at some point, or we were stonemasons in my family. And the other was my mother's singing voice. And yes, the oral tradition, absolutely, the tradition of songs as forms of stories, which is to say the ballad, and then just snatches of sound, snatches of conversation that you hear arbitrarily, that you record and report, and they start, earworms, I suppose, they start to haunt you. They start to haunt you.
Beautiful. Thank you for that answer. I don't know if I should have Sally more questions, or if maybe we could open to questions.
Yeah, I think it's time to include other people.
Yes, yeah, it's not, so it's not a one-way conversation. Maybe we could start with, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Comments and questions, please. Comments and questions, Julia.
Yeah, I thought it's so beautiful that, Eleonora, you're talking about the auto/biographical form of how we can't look at a singular life without looking at the way it's related to so many other lives. And that feels, particularly special, having this event with the two of you, where there is this chance.
There is an elective affinity, I will say.
Exactly.
I was so drawn to it both. Yeah.
Exactly. So I was just curious to know that the experience of having met each other, has that informed any of your research, Eleonora, what you've heard from Sally in person, and to Sally, has it informed the way that you think about your writing?
I feel odd. It feels very uncanny, to be honest. So like I said at the beginning, I feel like a ghost to myself. But I think as a child, I always felt like a ghost in my family. And it's one of the metaphors and tropes that I return to over and over again. Miss Cull, the teacher, is a kindly ghost. And I've always felt as though I'm a ghost in my own life. And that's partly because I'm sure we all feel like that in our own family at some point. We feel as though we're there and not there. But I think as a child, I had a very strong sense of being on the edges and on the outside. And in fact, that's where I positioned myself eventually. But I think there's part of me that, resists this theoretical language. It feels very alien to me to be talking about my own work in this way. So so I suppose what I can speak of is the way in which I write and the way in which I envisage. I have to be honest and say there's part of me that's a bit skeptical about the whole industry of biography and autobiography. But and if I had to say what I thought this was as a thing, I think the closest it is a form of fictional biography. So yeah,
Yeah,
it's,
yeah,
that's,
should it say
yeah, I
that
think
at the end? Yes.
that's the closest I will come to nailing my colours to any kind of definition. But
Yeah.
Eleonora, you should speak about what you.
Yeah, just it feels so special to work on Sally's books, and it's difficult to sometimes ask the right questions. You never know what if you're doing in a way a good job, because I feel like she will read the work at some point, so I feel the pressure of knowing or not knowing if I'm taking the right path, or if I'm doing a good job, and if it's something, if the way I'm reading the books is the right way. But then I think there's not one way, there's so many ways to interpret and study these books, which is the beauty of them. And they open up to so many questions and so many answers, and I'm still working on that in this voyage. Since we were using this metaphor before, I'm on this train with Sally. I don't know where it will stop, but I'm loving the trip anyways. Thank you so much for everything. I feel so lucky to be here today discussing this with her. Really, thanks.
I think I'm probably quite infuriating to track as well, because in some ways what I'm most interested in is the art of mystery and the experience of mystery, and the genre of mystery writing, which is the genre I fell in love with when I was 6 or 7, is the genre that I still rely on.
Yes.
And it's there in my next book, Pond Life, as well.
And I'm a bit of a detective, trying to discover things, and I have all these different hints which I'm trying to join together. I'm so excited.
And the book starts, the first chapter starts with nobody knows. Nobody knows about my grandmother Mays, nobody knows. And that refrain keeps coming back, the idea that you think you've got a solid object, you think, to use Wolf's term, you think you've got some granite, some historical fact. Well, you do have some historic facts. You do have dates. There is a temporality briefly sketched out between 1860, when Mary Neal was born, and 1987, which is the year of the Great Storm, as we called it. I think everyone called it that, or it's become that. And then there's 1944, which is the Sherbrooke Harbour, and then the storm that broke out. I think it was June 22nd, 1944. So you do have some delineations of dates. You do have epochs. But in the end, what I really want to do is to surrender this obsession, as we now have in our current world, with creating metrics and taxonomies for things, which actually kill off the thing itself. And that's, the illness, I think, in our current education system, is teaching the children how to recite the thing, and there being only one answer or one way of seeing, which I think is an absurd way of dealing with the arts. So in a way, I'm sort of conspiring with the idea of not knowing, which must be infuriating if you're trying to record me and track me.
No. Yeah, and I was thinking also to a kind of definition or anti-definition, since we are using quite an opposite term. You once defined this book as being anti-plot, you don't really have a linear progression, but rather an episodic narrative in a way. And I feel like you are describing life, you are closer to life as it is really lived, because you say that a plot is a thorough line, but life rarely follows straight through. So that's one of my favorite quotes from the book. What is peculiar about this, it escapes definitions, and it escapes the traditional way of telling and of storytelling. Yeah, maybe.
I'd love to hear, you mentioned you don't tend to, I don't know if you said schematize or
Yeah.
structure. I'd love to hear more about the just nuts and bolts, even if you have to do it in a teachery way.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe especially the very beginnings of writing a new book, when it's kind of moving from just thoughts to some words.
So one of the things I definitely rely on, what's your name?
And Tamarin.
Tamarin, that's right. Well, we've been in touch. Yeah, sorry, my memory's really bad as well. Symbols. I grew up in a religious household, and I live by and through symbols. Actually, I brought this in as my symbolic structure. I always have to have a prop. So this is the lighthouse. Obviously there's Virginia Woolf to the lighthouse, but there's also the lighthouse on the pier, which I return to several times in this book. So it's a landmark, but there's something about that shape which is fundamental, I think, to the way that I have structured this book. And we start on Shoreham Sands. We start with a perspective and a landscape. We start with the line of the cliff. So there's something important about the positioning of objects in space. So I think what I'm trying to do, Tamarin, is to create a sense of ordered space, which is a kind of composition. So I return to key symbols, yes, and then key spaces. So, but if I were to be more infuriating, I would say, and I do think this is true, I think that I rely on what comes out of my unconscious. And a large part of that is my dream life, which often is structured by symbols too, isn't it? So, and also and a certain kind of infuriating illogic, right? Which is life. I mean, life is not logical. There is no such thing as a plot. So I'm very suspicious of very schematized books. That isn't to say that there isn't structure. I think this is intensely structured. It wouldn't work if it were not. So there are iterations and iterations of symbols and images and refrains and names and characters. So the characters walk across the pages in a particular order, like a dance, like a piece of dance. So I write and live by structure. And I think actually James, who helps me with the podcast a lot, he says you just have deep structure. So there's what do we mean by deep structure? I mean, that's a difficult thing to define, but I think it's repetition of some kind, yes, which I think for me came out of learning poetry off by heart, learning songs off by heart, learning place names off by heart. I know so many road names in Oxford. I know the names of places off by heart. So, and then this very strong photographic memory, which I think I have. So I did work quite closely with photographs. Apart from the Shoreham's Beach painting by Turner, there are also a series of photographs. Some of them exist and some of them I made up in my own mind. So in a sense, what I did was I created a ghost album of my past. So a not real album, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and you can
Yeah.
never tell.
You can never tell. And again, it infuriates Eleonora.
it's
Just we think we've got somewhere.
you can never tell what's true and what.
And then also there's something really incriminating to me. The detective figure is very important in the next book. I wanted to be a detective. Who doesn't, right, when you're a child? But Eleonora comes with all her sources, and I go, and there's something about them. It's like Lady Macbeth, out, black spot, no, get away. I don't know, I don't want to be pinned down. I want to be making something new, but certainly there is a structure, and the buttons here. So these are a carryover from No Boys Play Here. So one of the emblems, if you like to use another word for symbol, one of the emblems of No Boys Play Here are the buttons that fall off the father's shirt at the beginning in the initial scene of violence, which is a kind of classic Aegon, a classical warriors fight, but in a seedy seaside town between the father and the uncle. And the buttons fall off, and then the buttons return towards the end. So there's a kind of smallness of detail that if you're not paying attention to and you're not reading properly, you won't see, but it's there, and it returns again and again. And I should also say that Mary Neal was the daughter of a button manufacturer, so that was very nice. I like that was important.
I agree with that. And if I have to choose like some keywords for my work, what are you working on? What can this structure be? I think intertextuality is a big word because you have this weaving of different narratives of different references from the canon, of different references from Salist, personal archive. And so you have this big intertextuality, and you also have this kind of, I would say, you try to interpret the references, and you have to be in a way an active reader, because when you are reading, especially the first books, you can grasp the references to other works, or you can grasp the references to particular episodes from history or from all that, only if you read really closely, really carefully. So it's a close reading you have to do with these books.
Yeah, exercise in paying attention, definitely. Does anyone else have any questions? Yes, behind.
Well, I don't know if I have a question or.
What's your name?
Christine.
Oh, Christina.
Yeah,
Hello.
this is my second week.
Hello.
I heard no one, so it was me.
Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for very interesting talk and presentation. I'm really interested in your work, actually, and I was thinking about the idea or role of imagination in autobiography and biography. I think that is a very problematic thing usually when doing research, for example, and I do my PhD research in TICA and autobiography, contemporary autobiography, and they have the writers I have been working with, they are usually criticized for relying too much on myths and nursery rhymes and legends and remedies and that kind of stuff, and they state that they need usually to go further, like beyond that the idea is very important to them, and the language of the official truth, which is usually not suitable for their experiences, for example. So they have to find a new language to narrate their experiences. And I was thinking about imagination as a way of giving voice to something that is otherwise obliterated. But how can that be also stigmatized? I mean, imagination as something that is not true or not leading to truth. And for example, there is a quote from the author I'm working with, which says that she doesn't care really, or she does care, but she uses imagination many times in autobiography because she thinks that leads to something that is truer than true, truer than mere fact, for example, and that gives her solace, for example. But I'm thinking also about, for example, I come from Spain, and we're now dealing with the idea of Spanish Civil War kind of stories, and the idea that we're losing our grandparents. And there are two usually strands regarding how we tell our ancestral stories and our story as well. And that is people who think that we need to stick to recording your grandparents talking, for example, and other people that need to imagine how they live. And that idea of I have been a ghost to my own family, I think that's really resonating with that, because I think about my grandmother, and she coexisting or living with people, me myself, that do not know their story. And it feels like I don't know what to think about it, how to feel about it. And I think it's very brave when you don't know your, for example, grandparents' stories or ancestor stories, and some way you find a way to go back to them. And I don't know if I have any question.
You're thinking about this necessity of truth, but I mean, I think what do we mean by truth? I mean, it's variegated, isn't it? And if I were to sit down again and write a second or third or fourth version of this book, I could do that easily. I would just move the parts around. And I think that's partly why, again, I'm being stubborn and obstinate, but the idea of a triptych is important to me rather than a trilogy, because again, this is me being an architect, because you can, isn't that awful, that sound? You can move the parts around, you can, show different parts of the triptych, like shutters on a window. And the image of shutters on the Green Lady Hostel is very important to my book as well. Shutters meaning window shutters, but also meaning the shutter of a lens on a camera. So, you can move the parts around. You can create a new kind of architecture every time you start to tell the story. Yes. And then who do you appoint? I have lots of unreliable narrators in here, even when they're claiming to be reporters. Binks is, I decided he had to be Catholic. Again, the symbols, but also because Mary is my middle name, and my father was Irish Catholic. And I've always respected symbolic, I've always respected symbols, even if sometimes I find particular associations distasteful. I feel like all of us need symbols, and that indeed is the structure of myth. If we study myth, we know that myth is born out of symbol, and from symbol we start to tell stories about those things we cannot explain easily, the ineffable, the unknowable, the unsayable, right? Death, for example. Yeah, how do you report on death? So Binks, my Daily Mail reporter, becomes a kind of almost Catholic saint, and he dies at sea as an unknown. He's a true anon. I call him a true anon. He's unknown. But before he leaves, I give him a refrain of poetry. I write a kind of prose poem for him inside the text as a sort of epitaph to his life, right? So what I'm more interested in, I suppose, is laying ghosts to rest in a kindly way, because in many ways the three books I've written, whatever you call them, there's a lot of pain and violence in the stories, and what this book, I think, was my attempt to lay people to rest. It's as I said at the start, it's a story of mourning. So in some senses, what I do is I lay out my bodies and I pray over them. So, which is an ancient ritual of remembering others, the dead and the deceased. So,
yeah.
Do you want to have one last question?
Yeah,
Sure,
he's in charge.
We
We've got one more quick question here.
Just a quick one. Are you reading the audio book?
I read all my own books, yes.
Because I love the way you perform them.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's what
I was very
actually
subdued today.
Yeah,
Because there are too many things I could knock over, so which I would.
that's actually, I wanted to add a short something to add, as the lady just said. What is beautiful also about your books is this textured interplay of voices. You do so many voices, you are performing so many different roles in these books, and yet also this shifting perspective here. Like, you expect from an autobiography to be narrated in the first person singular, and that's not something you will find here all the time. So you have to follow these shifts and get lost into the narrative, really.
And the audiobooks are performed.
Yes.
Yeah, so I want to say one final thing maybe about improvisation, back to this idea of stability and instability and truth. Every time I read my work, I perform it in a different way. So the words are dancing and alive. They have their own ephemeral force. And it's like repatterning. Every time I repattern the words, because they're not inert and dead on the page. They're not some scholastic monument that I'm paying homage to, this wonderful text of mine. I'm always repairing and restoring it and allowing those parts to move around to make something new. So
that was
Great.
an exemplary short question. Thank you all again for coming, and thank you for a really fascinating discussion, which I'm sure will draw on a great amount of inspiration from ourselves and amplifying thoughts. Just